So I'm back for the final OTB recap of 2022, although it's not the final video because, as I mentioned at the end of the last one, it's going to be 4 parts because this was a 8-round tournament that I played and 2 games a day, so it's going to be 4 days of action. And this tournament was long anticipated for me because after kind of a rough National Chess Congress, I basically decided for a full month from the end of November until the end of December not to play. And once basically winter break hit, I, along with a couple of my friends, traveled to Virginia for the Eastern Open. And actually, this was going to be my first time, or not my first time, but I think maybe my first time in a continental chess event playing in an open section with like really strong opposition. Because before that I'd been mostly playing in like some under 21, under 2200 sections. But this tournament I was closer to bottom of the pack, like maybe somewhere in the middle, but closer to the bottom half. There's a couple of GMs, some IMs, FMs, a lot of masters playing, so it was looking to be a good experience. And in round one, the way it turned out, because I was around middle of the pack, I ended up just failing the cut to play down, and instead I got thrown onto actually the second board to face a very strong player rated 2581 USCF, and that is none other than international master Mikola Bortnik. Now, if you're not familiar with the last name Bortnik, there are actually 2 brothers, 2 very strong chess players with that last name. The younger one is actually Alexander Bortnik, who is one of the strongest speed chess players in the world. Routinely finishes in the top 10 of Title Tuesday. He's beaten Magnus, he's beaten Hikaru in Blitz. His older brother by a few years is Mikola Bortnik, who is not a grandmaster, but is a very strong international master, peak FIDE, a little over 2,500 a couple of years ago. At the time that I played him, his FIDE was about 2455, I believe. And so I knew this was going to be a tough game. He's also a blitz specialist. At the time, rated around 2,900 blitz. I think at the moment that I'm recording this, he's even close to 3,000. So obviously a very strong player. And the interesting thing about this game is that, so I played just my normal stuff, and funny enough, his younger brother actually plays this a lot himself in all these games, which he's like done well against Magnus and all these other strong players. And so I checked his games online, and he's played a lot of like knight f3, just normal stuff here, but against me, because he's a high-rated player, he obviously wants to win, he plays something very aggressive, and that's g4, which is called the bayonet attack. Very aggressive testing system against the opening that I play. But it's not something that I really dread facing because I know that it's going to be sharp and I'm going to get some counterattacking chances. So the idea basically for white is that he's going to take some space on the queen side, put the bishop on g2, and bring the knight to e2, and later sometimes to g3 and f5, and sort of attack on the light square. So I need to strike back in the center. And when he plays knight e2 to defend the pawn on d4, the move that I have been playing here is this very interesting move introduced by a former #2 player in the world, Alexander Morozevich, and that's the move b5, where instead of like playing a6 or c6 to prepare this move, you just play it right away, because if white were to take, then they give up the defense of the e4 pawn, and then if they play bishop g2, you can just defend the knight this way. So normally white will not take because they don't want to lose their center pawn, and so they'll play something like a3 to stop b4. And now I played a6 defending the pawn because I'm going to need to defend it eventually. And now I just develop normally. We both castle. And here he immediately plays f4. And he was playing the opening pretty quickly. I mean, obviously, like, he's a strong player and a good blitz player, so he's going to play quick. And the very aggressive move, f4, but not necessarily the best, because when you push all your pawns forward, you're then liable to create some kind of weaknesses as well. And so I wasn't too concerned about this, because even though he's now kind of putting a lot of pressure on my center pawn, I just played bishop to b7, because I know that if he were to take ever, then he's kind of leaving some squares open that might be of use to me. Like if he definitely wouldn't take this way, because then he just kind of invites my knight into the center. I have this check maybe coming. If you were to push d5, well, again, I have this square for the bishop. I can reroute the knight and bring the bishop out this way. So I was never really under the impression that he would do that. I did think that maybe he could go g5, though, which looks a little bit scary because he attacks the knight and attacks the pawn on h6, so I'm kind of obligated to take. And then I was going to drop the knight back, but I saw he could go h4, and actually the engine agrees this would have been something that he could have maybe gone for, but he decided to just play a little bit more solid, just develop the bishop. And here is where I thought for about 5 minutes, and I made a very correct decision to actually take on f4, which might seem a bit counterintuitive, like why am I releasing the tension in the center, and why am I taking on f4 and not taking the center pawn? But actually, this is something that I picked up looking at a game of a stronger player in this opening, where they take this pawn, but the idea is now that they're basically stopping white from playing g5, because he doesn't really want to play it if he has to take back with the bishop. And my idea was to now play the move knight h7 and play bishop g5 and kind of try to fight back on the dark squares. Actually, the strongest move in this position, a move I didn't consider in the game, is the move c5. Kind of more actively counterattacking in the center. The reason I didn't consider this move is because I saw the threat of the move e5, which is something that you always have to think about when there's kind of like this tension between the bishops. And here you have to be very careful, because the point is that if I take the bishop on g2, if I take the bishop, then he can actually take this knight here, and then I take the rook, he takes the bishop, and he ends up getting 3 minor pieces for a rook and a bishop. So it's like very crazy, very difficult to evaluate. Actually, what it turns out is that I can take here, because if he takes on b7, then I take here, and now if he takes my rook, the fact that he gave up his bishop means that his kingside is just very exposed, and actually I have enough compensation to not even be equal, but even be slightly better here, because I can take on d4, he can't even take with the queen because of bishop c5. So really what would have happened is, again, this long series of trades, and then I would have had to find the move f5 to kind of keep some initiative and go for counterplay. But anyway, I decided to just go knight h7. It seemed like safe to me, because now e5 doesn't come with tempo, and I'm going to play bishop g5. He goes knight g3, and now I kind of chickened out of playing this move. And the reason for that is because when I was thinking about him taking, for some reason all I considered was recapturing with the knight, and I saw h4 coming and my knight getting kicked back, and then his knight coming in, and so I decided not to go for it. Whereas if I had just taken with the queen, something I for some reason didn't consider, I'm just doing perfectly fine here, because my queen is really nice. It threatens like a check here, it could go to h4, and yeah, he has to be really careful not to overextend, basically. But I played rook e8, which is a little bit inaccurate. He now goes queen d2, and he's beginning to activate his final pieces, and he's also hinting at maybe some sacrifices. Like I was already kind of on the watch to make sure I don't blunder some trick, like bishop takes h6. So I went knight to f8, looking to reroute the knight to g6. He goes queen f2. So he is setting up a battery on the f-file, and here I had to be really careful, because I realized if I go knight g6 now, he can actually sacrifice the bishop, because after I recapture, he has queen takes f7, and then he takes the knight on g6. So he basically wins the piece back, and he wins a couple pawns. My king is now blown open. So I played a very good move, queen d7, because my idea is to prepare to move the bishop, at which point the queen will be defending f7, and I realized that now if he sacrifices, he doesn't get enough, because I just moved the king into the corner, and if he comes in to try to threaten mate, I can simply move the bishop, and everything is defended. The queen defends g7 through his queen, and if he takes, I take back. So he goes knight f5. He jumps in. He still has quite a bit of time here. Like he hasn't spent more than 2 or 3 minutes on a move, and I'm already down to maybe an hour or so from the 80 minutes that we started with. And bishop's attacked, so of course I'm going to move it to g5. offering the trade. And here he played another kind of inaccurate move. Like, he just quickly played rook d1, just getting the rook into the game. What he really should have done was just backed up and not let me trade bishops, and then played h4 next, because once I'm able to trade the bishops as I did, I am able to now kind of get a little bit more of a grip on the dark squares, which is something he's lacking because most of his pawns are on light squares. And I now play a5 because I'm finally getting ready to get some counterplay. If I can kick his knight away from c3, then I kind of weaken his control over the e4 pawn, and then I can start to fight back a bit. And he now, again, like he thinks for a few minutes, he plays a little bit inaccurate move. He plays the move h4. What he maybe could have played, I thought that he might do this, and he mentioned this as a perhaps better after the game, is play b4 himself to stop me from playing b4. And I thought that I would get rook a3 in, but he suggested that he just goes rook d3, and then he can just bring his queen back. And objectively speaking, I'm maybe slightly worse, but he's definitely more in control here. I mean, he has the knight defended, he can slowly start to advance. So this definitely would have been better than what he did, which is h4, but that allows me to now... So first I throw knight g6, actually, and it allows me to play b4. And usually once black is able to get this in and kick the knight away, it's a sign that black is gaining some traction. I'm getting some counterplay. He decides not to take and open up the file for me. He decides to move the knight into the center. But my plan was just to take the knight and double his pawns. I did have to give up the bishop, but I'm not too worried about that because it wasn't that great anyway. And now I found another very good move, knight to e7, because I want to trade off his good knight on f5. And he, at this moment, just blitzes out bishop e4. I mean, I also consider that he might sack, but again, I calculated that I had it covered, because if he goes here, threatening queen takes knight mate, it's not in time because I can actually take on g4 and fork his king and bishop. So he just goes bishop e4, which after the game he said that he didn't like this move. He regretted it because he believed that he should have actually gone back and not let me trade pieces. But when he played this move, right, he played it so confidently, and what I have to explain is the psychology of playing a very strong player is a bit difficult because you feel like you're always under pressure. Like, this guy is 500 points higher rated than me, so I was always a bit cautious, and when he played this move, what I thought about was, okay, I can take on f5, but then he's going to take with the bishop. Now my queen's under attack, only has 2 squares, right, so I have to go to either d8 or e7. And I saw that he can attack my queen again. If I go back to d8, he can take this and then take here, although I hadn't realized that I could then take on h4 at the end. But basically, I thought that if I just trade, then his bishop is very active, my knight's like kind of stuck on h7. It just felt like I'm still under a lot of pressure, so I was looking for something kind of more active. And so I eventually played knight to f6. And I had actually seen what his response was going to be. I saw that he was going to sack the knight on h6, because when I take back with the pawn, he takes my knight, so he wins the pawn. But then I realized that I can take on g4, and now fork his king and his bishop. And once he goes back with the bishop, I was going to go back like this and offer a trade of queens. And if he accepts, then I'm happy because the queens are off and my position is pretty safe. Of course, he could go back, but I was pretty confident that I would be able to like maybe move the king out of the way and use the g-file actually to counterattack him. I just felt like his king ends up being less safe than mine. But as soon as I took on g4, he just blitzes out king h2. And I was like, what? He just hung his bishop on e4, but obviously that's part of the plan because he has something. I mean, at the same time, you know, my f7 pawn is hanging and he's threatening rook g1. So I think for a few minutes, I'm like, okay, I can take on e4 because he takes on f7. I mean, the most he has is a perpetual, right? Because, I mean, if he gives a check, I can go here, and it's just going to go check back and forth. But then he plays rook to e1, and I was like, oh, I did also not see that. Now my queen's under attack, and once it moves, he's able to take my knight on e7. So what I really should have done at this point was bring the queen back, allow him to take the knight, and if you can just imagine this position, and we're going to come back to it in a minute. I thought that I can just pick up this pawn on c2, because I'm going to lose the knight, but maybe if I get a pawn back at the same time, then I have better chances of fighting on in some endgame. But he plays rook f2, blocking the check. I bring the queen back. He takes. I have to take the rook, because otherwise I lose the queen. I have to put the king on h8, because if I block like this, he has this move winning the queen. If I go here, he has this move winning the queen. And then he plays rook g2. And now I realize that I'm just lost, because my queen has no good place to go. Anywhere it moves, I can't move, let's say, here, because he has this, and checkmate. But if I move like to h5, then this is mate. So I can't move the queen and also defend the g7 square. So I play rook e8, and now he just plays queen d7. And I have to resign, because I'm losing the queen. Or I have to give up the queen for the rook, and then the endgame's obviously going to be lost there. Now, if we go back a step, if I had brought the queen back immediately instead of taking on c2, the difference is that in this position he doesn't have queen d7, because I have this, and I actually am checkmating him. And I had actually seen this, but in my calculation I kind of confused the two lines, and I didn't realize that in the game what I did was I basically brought his rook onto the second rank, and now I don't have this check. So I was just really annoyed that I did that. Now, to be fair, that position is still losing for me, because he would, instead of moving the queen to d7, he would just take on my queen, and then he would pick up a pawn, and this endgame is winning for him, because he's just up 2 pawns. But at least, I wouldn't have basically had to resign on the spot, as I did in this position. So, yeah, it was an interesting game, definitely a learning experience. The biggest takeaway was that I realized that my opponent's rating, I allowed it to influence my assessment of the position too much, and I kind of lost my sense of objectivity, because really in this position, if we go back to this moment before I played knight f6, this position is actually completely equal, at least according to the computer. If I just trade on f5 and go queen e7, what I missed, this is what he pointed out to me after the game, if I just put my queen on f6, see, I didn't like this because I saw that he can take on h7, and then take my queen, trade rooks, and then take here. But actually, if I just play king g7, his rook now has to retreat, and my rook is going to infiltrate somewhere. He has too many pawn weaknesses. So really, he would have had to go king g2, and this position is, it's really just an equal rook endgame, because pawns are just going to start getting traded left and right, and once everything gets traded down, it's just a draw. So he would have had to somehow try to, probably not take the knight and try to milk the position somehow, but he admitted that it wouldn't have been easy, because his pawn's already so pushed up that there's really no going back. And he has a lot of weaknesses to kind of deal with. So yeah, definitely a learning experience there. But, that game's out of the way. Now we can proceed on to the next. So in the second round, I am now playing on a much lower board, and also against a much lower rated opponent. This guy is in the mid-2000s USCF, about 1,700 FIDE, like a teenager. And he plays the Sicilian, and he actually plays the 4 knights variation, which can be quite theoretical if you play into the main lines, but I like to play the move a3. And Black has a lot of options against this move, but he chooses one of the most principled ones, although he didn't really know any theory. He admitted that he was already out of book. He played the move d5. And I responded by playing bishop e5, pinning the knight, trading on d5, and castling. This is kind of all theory. I give him this isolated pawn on d5, and now I'm trying to just get ahead in development. I played bishop g5. This was kind of the last move of my prep. And, he could play h6 and kick my bishop back, but he decided to play the move rook to e8. And I am now out of book. This is the first moment where I have to like really think on my own, and I wasn't too sure what to do. I mean, these positions, they're kind of pleasant for white on one hand because black has this isolated pawn, but at the same time, it's kind of difficult to understand how to make progress. And I mean, I considered like going h3 to maybe not allow any kind of bishop g4 stuff, but I was not too sure. Like, I saw maybe he can do this, and there's like a bunch of trades about to happen. I eventually landed on the move queen to d3 with the intention of connecting the rooks, preparing rook d1, but also with the idea of maybe at some point I have this idea to go knight f5. He, in this position, what he probably should have done was played a6, maybe, and kicked my bishop back, and then traded here, maybe done something like this. He also could have perhaps played bishop c5, but he plays queen b6, which is also like a logical move because he's attacking the knight on d4, and getting the queen, connecting the rooks. And so at first I didn't know what to do, but then I realized that, wait a minute, I have a very interesting tactical idea here. See, his pawn on d5 is only supported by the knight. So I would love to take the knight and then take on d5. But that doesn't work because if I take and then take, then at the end, my knight on d4 hangs. So, what if I actually get rid of this bishop? And I started looking at the move rook takes e7, and the more I thought about it, the more I calculated, the more I realized it actually works. And so I hit him with this very unexpected sack. And there was a lot I had to calculate here, because he can take on e7 with the rook or with the knight, or he can take on d4 with the knight or with the queen. So if rook takes on e7, I take the knight on f6, and then I take the knight on d5, or sorry, the pawn, and I am hitting his queen and his rook. He can take my knight, but then I take his rook on e7, and he can't actually recapture because his knight has to defend his queen, so he would have to move the king, and already, I mean, I can basically trade into a very good endgame, like, let's say, take here, and then bring the bishop back. I mean, there's maybe even a more accurate version, but the point is that I'm doing well. He can actually take with the knight. That's the move he played in the game, so we'll get to that last. But he can also do this. But again, I take on f6, and if he takes like this, I can actually take the knight with the bishop. If he takes on b5, it's another possibility. Then I trade here and take here, and I'm hitting his queen, and I'm up a piece. A lot of these lines are very tricky, but they all just end up working for me. This is the last of them. He can take on d4 with the queen. But now I actually can just trade and then take here and take on d7 or take like this. So basically in every variation, I either win a pawn or win two pieces for the rook. And he decided to take on e7 with the knight, but that allows me to just trade down. I take on d7, take on e7, and take on d5. And now he has to move the queen, and I win back the rook, and now I'm just up a pawn. And actually, funny enough, there was a game that I found in the database that went exactly like this, like a GM against an IM, where the exact first like 17 moves, or maybe even 18, because I think he also played knight f5. So I was happy with that we basically followed like a very high level game. So basically now what I'm left is with this very pleasant position that I have to now try to convert. I played rook to d1, attacking the knight. Idea is that if he plays knight e5, I can even play queen to d8, and I basically force a queen trade, because if he goes here, I can just trade queens, and I'm happy to do that. He goes rook e8, though, creating a counter threat on the back rank, so I have to make sure not to blunder by taking the knights. I could have played knight e3. This maybe would have been the most safe move I could have played, but I went knight to d6, because I realized that if he goes here, I don't mind, because I can actually block with the queen, and like I said, trading queens and trading pieces is in my favor here. So he goes knight e5. I go queen d5, once again offering a trade. He goes rook to d8, basically saying that you can trade, but then your knight is going to be pinned to your rook. But I did it anyway because I realized I can just move the rook up and bring the knight back. And, I mean, he basically has nothing better than to trade rooks, because if he moves the rook, he gives up the file. So now all I'm left with is the task of converting this knight endgame up a pawn, and he has kind of a weak pawn on e6, so shouldn't be too difficult. He already kind of made a bit of an inaccurate move by going with the knight. I thought that he should have brought the king in as quickly as possible, like maybe even put the king on d5 or e5. But when he played knight to d6, I was happy to get the move f4 in, just controlling the e5 square so he can't advance his pawn. And then I brought in the king. He brought his king to f5, which perhaps for that reason I should have put the king on f3 so that I could meet this with g4. But I went here, he went here, and I played h3 to not allow his king any further. I prepared g4, so he obviously has to stop that. And I'm just kind of patiently advancing my pawns, making sure not to allow any weaknesses or any kind of tricks. He goes e5 now, and he wants to trade off the pawns and just try to like plant his king in the center, make it hard for me to advance. But here I came up with a very nice idea. Instead of taking on e5, I actually threw in this g4 check. And the point is that if he takes now with the king, I take on e5, and his knight has to now move, and now I have a passed e-pawn. And although he also has a passed pawn, because mine is farther advanced, because my king is now more active, I have the upper hand. So he decides not to take, he goes back, but now I go check, and he cannot go king here because a knight trade automatically means he loses the game. So he goes back, and now I know I'm very close to winning, but I just need to like slowly build up to a trade of knights. I go b3, he goes g6, and my idea was to now play knight c4, offering a trade of knights. And what I had actually calculated is that even though I allow him to double my pawns, then king and pawn endgame is actually winning for me, because he is going to end up in zugzwang. And he thought that he was fine in this position, but what he had missed is that I can actually, I'm not going to move my king because I don't want to give up that 5 pawn, but I can actually sacrifice a pawn back and then play c4. And he's now out of moves. He has to move the king back, and I take, and he resigned in this position because I'm going to, I mean, I could take his a5 pawn and make 2 queens, or I could just promote the c pawn. So that was actually a very smooth game. It was like 97% accurate. I was pretty happy with it. I mean, bouncing back from that loss with like a very nice win. So 1 out of 2 after the first day, and day 2 is just going to be even more exciting than the first.